talk about the sex myth, and you're probably wondering what is the sex myth, and the answer is really there isn't a sex myth, but there are a lot of sex myths, and these are things that we take to be true, possibly on very, very little evidence. So what are some common sex myths? Just going to click through a few of them. That women don't want sex, they prefer companionship, that men are potential rapists. Many women are trafficked into the UK for the sex trade. Drug-addicted streetwalkers are more common than call girls. Porn is the biggest entertainment industry, and sex addiction is a growing disease. Now there's a rule of journalism that sort of goes approximately, if the title asks a question, the answer is no. So as you could probably predict what I think of most of these. But where do these innate assumptions come from? And obviously I stole that from Philip Larkin because, Talent borrows, genius steals, and he is a genius. So I came up with something that I like to call the feedback model. And what is the feedback model? Well, it's how these things enter the media and enter what we would call common knowledge. And they manage to keep going in spite of the fact that they might be incorrect or they might be exaggerated. So let's say someone spots a shock statistic about, the number of bras being bought for 10-year-olds. The next thing that goes on with that is someone comes up with a statistic that is fitted to some kind of predetermined message, saying, for instance, what percentage of 10-year-olds this represents in the UK. The next step happens when little or no critical thought is applied, because, to be honest, when you have a really shocking message, it's easy to coast by on that alone. And a lot of people are still getting over the shock, so they never really ask, well, does this mean something? The next step is that there's no support for concerned people. And this is a really important thing in the kind of mythologizing to do with sex and sex issues, is that there are very good reasons why people would be concerned about these things. There are discussions that need to happen, that need to go on in the public sphere, and people do just kind of tend to brush it under the carpet. Finally, somebody writes about this phenomenon. For instance, somebody might notice that a lot of people on Mumsnet are concerned about this, and then when somebody writes about that, it goes straight back around to the shock statistic that we started with in the first place. And does anybody know who this is?
Roy Rogers.
Roy Rogers and his horse?
Trigger.
Trigger, because this is a trigger warning. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking about one sex myth in particular, simply because there's no time to really cover everything. And the one that I'm going to focus on is the myth that adult entertainment venues, such as lap dancing venues, contribute to the rate of sexually violent crimes such as assault and rape in the areas that surround them. I'm calling this a trigger warning because obviously for people who have experienced these incredibly violent and invasive crimes, talking about it in a very frank way can be quite uncomfortable, so I do apologize in advance for that. Now, there was a claim in a report that came out in 2003 that claims that rape increased 50% in Camden after lap dancing arrived there. And this claim was made in a paper that was produced by the Poppy Project, which was an offshoot of Eves for Women, which is a charity that, as well as sort of running domestic violence shelters, also actively campaigns against the sex trade, among other issues. This statistic went round the world. As they say, the lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And the question arose in a lot of people's minds, but not very many, was this actually true? So this is just one of the articles that discussed it, which was in my personally favorite newspaper, The Guardian, because they love me. Talking about and interviewing people who work at lap dancing venues. And this is quite a recent article. So this I believe was published in 2008, which would have been 5 years after the original study came out. So by then, this statistic that rape had gone up 50% in Camden after lap dancing venues opened there had already passed into legend. It was something that you could cite in a newspaper article without really having to discuss any of the issues within it. Well, at this point, 5 years later, somebody actually looked at the paper, the original report, and actually looked at the numbers and said, well, oh, just go back to that one if you would, please. That actually, it didn't go up by 50%. There was a very small but significant miscalculation, just a simple arithmetic miscalculation, that meant that using the numbers that they provided, it actually only went up by 33%. And you're still thinking, that's still quite a big rise. And yeah, rightly so. And if we could have the next slide now, please. However, it does open the door to start to question whether or not the people producing these statistics, if they couldn't get the basic arithmetic right, whether they had been as careful as perhaps they could have been with the rest of the report. And I kind of got off the screen a little bit here, but that's okay. What are some of the things we should look for when you see scarce statistics that are related to sex? What are some of the hallmarks of bad sex statistics? The first one is that they tend not to calculate a rate. And what this means is if you are calculating something that happens in the population, such as the occurrence of a certain kind of crime, you can't just report the number and say between X year and Y year, this went up from the number 50 to the number 75. What's more important is to know how prevalent it is within the population. And of course, the population could have changed in that time. So to give an example, let's say somebody claimed that between 1970 and 2001, the number of Chinese restaurants trebled in London. Is this actually an informative statistic? Well, it doesn't tell us anything related to the number of people within the city. It doesn't tell us anything related to the size of a particular ethnic community, or indeed the number of restaurants and how that changed over time. So that's one thing to look for. Another thing to look for is whether or not these statistics show a long-term trend. So to go back to that Eves paper, this was a report that was released in 2003. It was only examining the 3 years before that. Now, lap dancing clubs had actually existed before those 3 years. So you do start to ask yourself, well, if they didn't include the years previous to that, they're not actually starting at the year dot, or indeed even comparing it to the years before lap dancing arrived. What does that tell us? Another feature of bad sex statistics is they don't involve a control group. Now, control groups are notoriously difficult to try to recruit. And certainly when we're doing population studies, it's even more so. I used to work in public health epidemiology. And one of the main things that you learn there is, as hard as you try to get the perfect control group, there really is no such thing. However, there's a lot of things that you can do. So going back to that original study, it did compare Camden with other areas in London, but it didn't compare it against any areas which didn't have lap dancing or adult entertainment, and that was a key flaw in that report. Correlation does not equal causation. That's one that we're probably all familiar with. And then finally, follow the money. Who funds or conducts the report? Where does it appear? Who's pushing the message? And what might their agenda be? So we can have the next slide. I went back because I have a lot of time on my hands. And I looked at the years 1999 to 2008 in this column, and you probably didn't come here for charts and graphs, but I brought them to you anyway. I'm that good. We've got the number of rapes, which was what Eves were using in that report, although they were only using, I believe, 1999 to 2002. Then went and found the publicly available population statistics for the borough of Camden in London, calculated the rate per 100,000, and then calculated the percentage change. If we could have the next slide, please. So it does show, between 1999 and 2003, you do have it going up quite sharply. You have a rise of 17.9% and then just shy of 4% each year afterwards. Then you have a massive drop, 26.8 minus, 28.5 minus, minus 42.1 in 2008. Now, Looking at that, what does this tell us? Again, going back to the trigger warning, rape is a very violent crime. We know that it is underreported. We know that there are a lot of cultural reasons for that. However, it is so rarely reported that the fluctuations in any one year really cannot necessarily be attributed specifically to something that might be going on in that area or to any one thing. It's a really multifactorial problem. So I could have the next slide, please. So I graphed this. Again, I'm sure you came here for a university lecture. Circled in red on the left-hand side of the graph, you can see the rate rise that was reported, well, that wasn't they reported the number rise, but I've calculated the rate rise in the years covered by the Eves report, and then to the right of that you can see what happens afterwards. It goes down. So this starts to suggest that perhaps the years 1999 to 2002, instead of giving us some kind of worrying trend, were possibly an anomaly. If we could have the next one after that. Then I graphed this versus the boroughs of Islington and the borough of Lambeth. Now, Islington contains fewer lap dancing clubs than Camden does, but still contains them. Lambeth doesn't have any at all. And you can see with their trend lines, they're actually well above Camden most of the time. So these are areas that actually have less lap dancing, or, crucially, are purported control group, none at all. And then below that, this bottom line, this is England and Wales in general. So it shows you that over time, Camden's rate of the occurrence of these crimes has actually started to conform with the average for England and Wales in general. So going back to the feedback model, what does this represent? Well, it is absolutely true to say, as the Eves report stated, that rape in Camden did go up from 1999 to 2002. That is indisputable fact. The next step, somebody pointed out that lap dancing venues exist there. After that comes the assertion that these must be related. And then the really crucial step, the thing that's missing, there really is not support for victims, for residents in the area who might be concerned about how the face of their community is changing. And of course somebody writes about lap dance because the local community are concerned about this, referencing, surprise, surprise, original statistic about rape in Camden going up between 1999 and 2002. This is a zombie statistic. And in spite of the fact that in 2008 somebody pointed out that it had been miscalculated, in spite of the fact that I wrote a paper about this in 2010 that came out in 2011 about the statistic, it still pops up in the newspapers from time to time. And very often this is because when somebody's writing a story, they are interested in getting a statistic. They want to add evidence to their story. What do? They Google it. What gets the most Google hits? The thing that was reported the most. The initial incorrect statistic. The zombie statistic goes on. Right, this, does anybody know who that is in the upper left? Deep throat from all the president's men. So he's telling us to follow the money for old rope. And let's take an example. Let's look at Glasgow, where the application for a sex establishment in the city of Glasgow, say he wanted to open a sex shop within the city limits selling, vibrators and loads of copies of 50 Shades of Grey or something. Just to make the application, you have to put in a £12,000 non-refundable fee, which is, if I'm not mistaken, or I may have been misinformed on this, again, my own Googling is here or there, at least 8 times what it is in Edinburgh. And as well, the guidance information that goes along with the application says, be advised that in the past, applications have been refused on the grounds that the committee felt that the number should be nil. So they are warning people who make this application, you can go ahead, give us your £12,000, you're not going to get it back, and it's not going to be granted. The next slide, please. The consultation, which informs the City of Glasgow's policy on this, was actually written by Julie Bindel, who is a member of the board of Eve's Women, which wrote that original Camden report with the erroneous statistics in it. The consultation includes those incorrect statistics. And how much does she make from recycling what I would call this junk? Well, I went on Twitter and I asked her. Because she does quite a lot of consultations, not only for places like the City of Glasgow, but also for charities that are working towards policy as regards sex workers, not only in this country, but in developing countries. She answered me. I asked her, so how lucrative is this, is doing this, Julie? She replied in her incredibly straightforward way, absolutely lucrative as fuck. Now, I used to be a statistician, and sometimes as a hobby still am. I wish I could trot out a statistic from 2003 over and over again and make a living off of that. And maybe by writing this book, I kind of am. Next slide, please. So, the zombie statistic goes on and on. Very recently in Cornwall, for instance, there was an application that was made for a club, and the council in Newquay opposed this after the head of police there came out and said that, well, everybody knows that these clubs contribute to sex crimes, and of course this is a very shocking thing, and the police say it absolutely must be true, and we have Stephen Gilbert, MP for the area, who was delighted that the Cornwall Council rejected the application for a lap dance club on Newquay's High Street, a victory for people power. In spite of the fact that just a couple of years ago, the local paper, the Newquay Voice, reported that sex assaults were down since the lap dance clubs started to open in Newquay. And again, having a lot of time on my hands as I do to do random statistics, I went and looked at the years in question that the Newquay Voice was talking about, the total population of the specific council within Cornwall Council that Newquay is located in, the number of reported sexual assaults and rapes, and the rate per 100,000, and sure enough, the rate had actually halved within the time since the first lap dance club opened. Now, it would be very irresponsible to suggest that there was a connection, that the opening of lap dance clubs somehow prevents sexual assault or rape, but I think what this does do convincingly is at least it breaks the link. So we have statistics from places like Camden showing that there isn't a direct relationship between the existence of these venues and the incidence of these crimes. We also have similar statistics from Newquay showing that there's an inverse relationship between these two things. And in fact, when you look at the worldwide literature, it shows a very mixed picture all around. Again, going back to the original thesis, that this is a far more complicated question than simply saying, oh, it's the lap dance clubs that are causing it. And so after the council in Cornwall rejected the application for this lap dance club in Newquay, somebody, not me, I do so wish it was, did the Freedom of Information Act on the police, asking, what, by the way, is your evidence that these two things are connected? Turns out, the Newquay police have no evidence for the sex attacks claim. Well, I don't know what they call it in Cornwall, but where I come from, that's called making things up. Why does all of this matter? Why specifically am I so concerned about this one issue? There's four big things to really unpack here, and maybe when we get into Q&A we can discuss this. First off, it's an unfair judgment of men and sexuality. It paints a picture that all male sexuality is necessarily reactive, that men are absolutely slaves to lust, and having seen a naked lady, that their only outlet, having done that, their only way of processing that stimulus is to go out and forcibly rape someone. The second thing And that's the cover of Nicholas Grote's book, Men Who Rape, The Psychology of the Offender, which is a fantastic book, because it discusses in depth the fact that there are different kinds of rapists. It's a very complicated crime. Now, this is something that we know. When we talk about crimes that are horribly invasive against a person, such as just regular physical assault or murder, we understand that it isn't simply one stimulus, one reaction kind of crime. So why do we assume this to be the case with rape? And of course, it's very well known within certain circles that there is no one cause, no one reason why, that it is a very, almost an individual thing and down to the person. The other problem with things like this, the next one please, is that putting all of the focus on adult entertainment deflects attention from the causes. It makes it more difficult for effective rape crisis messages to last when you have an assumption that, oh, we've already figured out what causes this and all we need to do is close down the lap dancing clubs and that's going to solve everything. It's very difficult if you have a very nuanced message about these crimes and about an epidemic of crime to battle against something that comes across as so black and white. And finally, it doesn't help the police and it doesn't help support services. It's really looking for a needle in a haystack when you're looking at entirely the wrong haystack. So, oh yes, finally, why it matters. Councils, such as Glasgow City Council, are making actual policy from this rubbish, making actual policy from statistics that were not true in the first place, that were miscalculated, which has since been disproven on lots of different levels. They're still going ahead with this as if it's still relevant, as if this is still the answer. And really, I think we should be asking them, why is this so? What is their agenda really? And as well, just asking harder questions of where our policy comes from. So that's pretty much the end of this thing. In the great words of Inigo Montoya, as regards other issues, no, there is too much. Let me sum up. Are drug-addicted streetwalkers more typical than call girls? Next, please. No, indoor sex workers outnumber streetwalkers 10 to 1. Women don't want sex, they want companionship? No, women are not only interested in sex, but they're also, studies are showing, interested in porn. Many women are trafficked into the UK for sex. No, the trafficking stats are exaggerated and used for political ends. And finally, sex addiction is a growing disease. Sex addiction is a new and non-clinically defined industry. Which brings me more or less to the end. I've got a resources page on my website, and the reason why I have it is because the book quotes a lot of studies, a lot of papers. You can actually go out and find these on the web, and I've put the links all in one. I think that's actually good. Those are good discussions to be having, which is why I put the website out there, so people can go and read these things, and then, you know, let's have a real debate on it, not just a black and white shutting it down, one-sided discussion. And then there's one last slide, which I think just brings us to the end. So that's the main bit, and hopefully we've got plenty of time to dig into some Q&A.
Very, very interesting. Now, hopefully, we have a roving mic person. So, questions?
Thanks, that was very interesting. I just wondered, in light of the statistics that you were talking about there and how they're used to create policy, a local situation that we have at Edinburgh City Council is there's a great move to challenge the licensing of saunas and lap dancing venues within Edinburgh recently. It's an ongoing situation, but more importantly, nationally, there's a member of the Scottish Parliament that's about to go out to public consultation on the criminalisation of the purchase of sex in Scotland, and I just wanted you to have any comment on that.
I've been following something that was some interest because, of course, it came up in the last session of Scottish Parliament as well, sponsored by another MSP, and went to consultation. And the consultation, in terms of the raw numbers too, was overwhelmingly in favour of criminalising the exchange of money and sex, I guess if I could put it that way. But in the end was battered down, and there are really very, very good reasons why. Mainly to do with when you look at the sort of countries that this sort of policy is patterning itself after. So to take, for instance, an example, let's look at Sweden, where since I believe it's 1997, it's been a criminal offence not to sell sex but to buy it. So it doesn't criminalise the prostitute, but rather the client of the prostitute. And what this has led to is really a bit of a time bomb, because what we have is a government that is not interested in outreach to different sectors of society, to different people within the sex trade. It's not collecting any kind of statistics in terms of whether they're accessing services such as HIV and other STI prevention and things like that. And also the word on the ground, the things that I've actually heard from people is touring girls from places like the UK are going over to Sweden and they're making an absolute bomb. They are raking in the cash because it hasn't eliminated the demand. And in spite of the fact that it doesn't actively criminalise the people selling sex, it does have the effect of driving them underground, because if your clients are criminals, you're not just going to be hanging out somewhere where people can find you. You know that the police are going to come and surveil you. So it potentially puts the people who are selling sex in quite a lot of danger as well. And over and again, we've seen this in countries where, you know, they've adopted the so-called Swedish model. I genuinely hope Scotland does not go that way, because I think that the net effect would actually be driving people towards a criminal lifestyle rather than supposedly rescuing them.
As an out former sex worker, how do you cope with the stigma, whether that's real or perceived? And do you foresee a shift in the portrayal of sex workers in general?
I think that's a really good question, because personally, you know, and I really can only speak for myself on this count, what I feared would happen if people had known that I had a past in sex work was far worse than what actually happened to me. So I thought that, you know, I would lose my job as a scientist, but in fact my workplace was very, very supportive. But I have to temper that with the knowledge that it was a very individual kind of situation, that every day there are people who are stigmatized when friends, family and co-workers find these things out. I'm not sure if necessarily there will ever be a point in my life where it becomes, you know, accepted. I'm not sure it would ever be acceptable or respectable necessarily. But that's really hard to say, and certainly I think one of the great benefits of things like blogging and other kinds of social media is for people who are involved in sex work to be able to share their stories, not just among themselves and with each other, but also with the public. And I do think that goes a very, very long way. But also as well, I've benefited from the fact of, you know, I come into this with quite a lot of privilege. I'm a very well-educated person, had a fairly respectable job, and I do think that puts people slightly on the back foot as regards criticism. A lot of people don't really have that, and you know, there's just not a lot of sympathy, you know, for a lot of people. So it's something that I hope will change over time, but only very slowly, I think.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for that. I'm coming to this as a bit of a skeptic, and I think I'm going to suggest that you put forward myths that straw men, or straw women, that you can bust quite easily. Some of the myths that you put up, I don't know where these myths comes from, so it's quite easy to prove that, you know, they are the case. And I think the thing about rape, I think it's quite spurious, and I agree where you're coming from on the East Project. You know, they're taking a statistic to prove something that they wanted to prove. But I think the issue about rape really isn't about the cause of rape, it's actually about the impact on women and the services that women need. And I think you put forward a few myths here. Glasgow Council don't have the policy because Julie Bindel did a consultation. They have the policy that they do about the sex industry because the Scottish Government and the Changing Lives, Safer Lives says that commercial sexual exploitation of women and men is a gender-based violence and they do not promote that, and they're asking councils to take action on that, and because law have agreed to that. So it's not just, that research and that consultation back that up. And another thing when you say, just one thing.
Well, no, let's come back to the second thing. We'll come to the first one, and then if there's a follow-up question. I pick on Julie Bindel quite a lot in the book because like myself, she's someone who's quite visible from a particular point of view. So I completely understand, it's not necessarily her responsibility. But nevertheless, policy just doesn't come out of thin air. When we talk about, the Glasgow Council and they're talking about gender-based violence, they're getting their information from somewhere. And when you actually go into the resources that are offered on the official pages, those are what they're referencing. So they are drawing on that information, referring to that information and using that. Yes, but it comes from somewhere. But it doesn't come out of thin air, and this is the point. It doesn't come out of thin air.
The idea that Julie Bindel can come up to London and tell 5 million people in Scotland and a Scottish government and a council that actually we don't know fuck all and you just got to listen to her.
But she doesn't say that in the report, and I don't imply that she does. What I'm saying is that the government went in search of evidence that specifically supported a point of view that they already had, and this doesn't come out of thin air. They're not just inventing policy from nowhere. More so, they're turning around and using the statistics, erroneous statistics sometimes, in these kinds of reports in order to continue to support things that they already believe, and that's really problematic. I absolutely agree with you that there is a discussion to be had that is more about the meat of what does this mean for women, what does this mean for relationships between the genders, and a more criminological question. But I disagree when people fall back on using the same old statistics that have been disproven for a very long time in order to do so, because I think that does shut down the debate on some level. I think we should probably talk about this a bit more afterwards and let somebody else ask a question, but I would certainly be interested to follow it up with you. I think other people have questions. Thank you very much for your input.
I was wondering, as a woman and a former sex worker, what you feel are some methods which are able to create the ability for men to be able to relate to women as human beings rather than as sex objects. I mean, do you feel it would be better to have, instead of lap dancing parlours, have talk to women parlours instead, where men go along and they pay money to actually be able to talk to women as human beings?
I would hope that they're doing that with the women in their lives, their colleagues and their friends and family generally. Although, just as a sideline to that, I would say that certainly when you're going to a strip club or encountering lap dancing, that there are certain areas of the sex industry or watching porn, for instance, which are entirely reliant upon response to visual stimuli. But also as well, people do often overlook the fact that quite a lot of escorting isn't just the sex itself and the objectification of somebody during the sexual act, but there's quite a lot of seeking connection, seeking human connection and companionship. There are a lot of escorts who would generally agree with me that that's actually the majority of the job, is having the conversation with your client first. But obviously when you look at things like strip clubs, there's a lot less of that going on. I say this as somebody who hasn't worked as a stripper, so I may be completely talking out of my ass there.
Hi, Brooke. You touched on trafficking. Now, we could probably sit and talk about trafficking all night and all the rest of the week.
That'd be a brilliant week. let's do that.
Yeah, you're on your own. What do you say to the view that society's best view of dealing with trafficking, rather than criminalising the purchase of sex, the best way of attacking the trafficker is through the legitimate sex industry itself, the uncoerced sex worker?
Well, I think that there are a lot of approaches that haven't yet been tried. I mean, trafficking is problematic on a lot of levels. Firstly, because very often things are miscategorized as trafficking, which aren't. So to go back to another report which came out, the Big Brothel report from Ease, the way they categorized trafficked people would have categorized me as a trafficked person, simply because I'm foreign born. In spite of the fact that I didn't, I wasn't forced into the country, wasn't forced into the business. Just by simply having been born somewhere that wasn't the UK, I would have been classed as trafficked. So there's the problem there in terms of estimating the numbers. Although that said, it's just a very nebulous and difficult thing to do. But where we go from there, really, we've got this problem that a lot of the things that fall under the umbrella of what we call trafficking are actually already illegal. So, for instance, some of the employment issues, such as somebody's told they're coming to the country for, say, a domestic work job and end up being trafficked into sex work, or somebody's told that they're coming to be a waitress and they end up as an illegal cockle picker, sleeping 8 to a mattress in the back of a van kind of thing. A lot of those things are already illegal, and really the focus needs to be on gathering better information about where it is going on. Certainly in terms of the sex industry, some of the best sources of information that police actually have, and they generally acknowledge this to be the case, comes from non-trafficked, non-forced sex workers and their clients reporting to the police either face-to-face or anonymously. It does raise the question that if we start to criminalize some parts of this relationship, are the police also going to lose their inroads into detecting when crimes are happening in the sex industry? And that's something that's really difficult to predict.
Hi, my name is Violet, and I'm regularly criticized for outing myself as a sex worker because, like you, I'm young, white, upper middle class, able-bodied. I'd like to, I wonder if you could comment on how you feel about these. You mentioned your privilege as a thing, but how we can respond to those critics that we're not really giving a voice to, say, migrant sex workers, more street workers. I mean, it's absolutely true that there aren't representatives of the sex industry who have much less privilege than us, and indeed many of the people who do have voices in the sex worker rights are male, for example, or have other kinds of privilege.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, and I can see where the criticism comes from as well, because especially when you look at people who write about sex work, it does tend to be people who look and sound very much like us, and so that is used to generally kind of write off that contribution. I do have really high hopes because the accessibility of things like social media makes it possible for people who otherwise would experience a lot of hurdles to, just getting their voice and getting their experience out there to allow them to do so. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that the media very often overlook them. So I wasn't the first person who was a sex worker and escort in London to be blogging about it. Arguably, the first person to do that was Ebony Prue, but she's a BBW and she's black, and her experience is very, very different from mine, and you could sort of see where the media might just kind of skip over, saying, oh wow, there's this really exciting London escort blogger, and skip straight over her and go to me, because someone like me does present, even when I was anonymous, as somebody more reassuringly media-friendly and a lot less challenging. So I think it comes from both sides, really, just trying to encourage more people to get their voices in there. Male sex workers, trans sex workers are very unrepresented, I think, speaking about experiences. But also kind of putting the pressure on, and I do feel very privileged in a way, not only just because of my background, but also the position I'm in, to kind of point people towards people like Prue, whom I very much admire, and she's still working as an escort, and she's still blogging about it, and she's still doing her thing. There's such a wealth of experience and information there. The main thing to keep in mind is that, sex work is not any one person's story. No one of us is the story of sex work or the definitive last word. I had a positive experience, other people have mixed experiences, people have negative experiences. It should all be out there. It's really a very broad church. Well, I don't know if church is quite the right word, but you know what I mean.
Thank you very, very much again. I'm not going to come to you via the microphone. Thank you very much again. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you for having me.
Brooke Magnanti.